Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. Today we're talking about how the civil rights movement shifted party loyalty in the South. And we have Dr. Beienberg with us today to have that discussion kind of about political parties, American history, just all of it. So, Dr. Beienberg, when we talk about the civil rights movement, how did that shift party loyalty in the South?
So I'm going to take an iconoclastic take, and I actually think that the argument is not the one that's the conventional narrative. So I'll start with what the conventional narrative is, how most people understand it, and then say a few words about why I don't think it's actually correct. And that's a debate that's going on among scholars. So the conventional narrative goes something like this, that the Republican Party had historically been the party of civil rights, and the Democratic Party had basically been the party attached to sort of Southern white supremacy. Even in the North, even if Northerners weren't attached to white supremacy, they had an electoral incentive to play along with it for party coalitional maintenance. And so the narrative goes basically during the civil rights era, the Democrats, particularly in the 1960s, whether this is because Kennedy always wanted to do it or Johnson sort of cynically attached himself to it afterward or strategic reasons, but Johnson embraces the civil rights movement in 63 after Kennedy's death and pushes through particularly the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the narrative then goes that because Barry Goldwater was squeamish about the Civil Rights Act particularly, and we'll talk more about him, but that he ends up positioning the Republicans as the relative anti-civil rights party, and Johnson positions the Democrats as the pro-civil rights party. Again, there are reasons I'll talk about why I don't think that narrative is quite right. And then the story goes that basically what happens is that white Southerners move into the Republican Party, basically because they've been influenced by what they see as Goldwater's skepticism of civil rights, and black voters in the South who now actually can vote. It's worth emphasizing. They basically couldn't vote before that. So they're pretty much entering the party system altogether, that they embrace the Democratic Party. And so the narrative effectively is, and there's often vulgar, I think it's apocryphal comment from Lyndon Johnson. There's two versions of it, but one of them is, but the core of it is he basically, according to this apocryphal quote, says he's pretty much capturing black voters to vote as Southern Democrats. At the same time, he's scaring off Southern whites as Southern Democrats, right? So there's permutations of this that are, I think mostly apocryphal. So that's the short version. So the narrative again is basically Republicans and the Democrats switch relative places on civil rights, and so therefore the party coalition switch. That's the conventional narrative. Probably what they want you to put on the AP test or whatever. There are a lot of scholars that still argue that. There are reasons that I think that narrative doesn't work. If you look at sort of the broader history, both before and after. So one thing that I think is worth emphasizing, and this teases a little bit of the podcast that we're going to do next on how the parties have shifted, but there actually isn't that much movement on the Republicans in terms of their perspective on civil rights. If you look at the Republican perspective on civil rights in, say, the 1850s or 1860s, they want to have formal legal equality. You can look at the Civil Rights Act of 1866. They want basically formal legal equality, colorblind. They get, John Marshall Harlan's colorblind constitutionalism. They want federal enforcement of the civil rights as much as allowed by the Constitution's enumerated powers and federalism and such. So Goldwater, for example, has, by even his critics concede this, has an exemplary record on civil rights when he's at the state level and in previous federal legislation. He's squeamish about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So he's very defensive of the 57 Civil Rights Act and others, but he's squeamish about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 for two parts of it. The rest of it he's on board with. But there are two sections, Title II and Title VII, that the Johnson administration is defending on grounds that the sweeping Commerce Clause lets them do that, sweeping the scope of the Commerce Clause. And we've talked about that before, the Wickard case that we laughed at. Most of our colleagues end up chuckling about how silly the reasoning is. But that's the case that they cited for those two provisions. So Goldwater, who's squeamish about the Wickard case, doesn't want to vote for it on those two grounds, not because he's against civil rights, but he doesn't think the federal government can regulate particular kinds of private businesses. Many of his other colleagues disagree. So Goldwater is in fact quite anguished about that. He actually consults constitutional scholars and says, if I think this case sucks, can I still vote for this thing or not? So the Republican position doesn't really move. What is clear is that the Democratic position moves from being the anti-civil rights party. I mean, the Southerners are, filibustering basically the Civil Rights Act of 57, the Southern Democrats, to Johnson basically repositioning them. So there's movement on that front. So whether that's a flipping, I don't think is quite fair. Basically, I think the argument is the Republicans stay consistent and the Democrats move from being a very aggressively anti-civil rights party to being a pro-civil rights party with the understanding, particularly that develops into something like affirmative action, right? So they move basically versus the Republicans staying sort of flat. Now, again, that's just me being descriptive, not saying which is better, worse, or anything. But the one basically stays the same, the other moves. But so that's part of why, sort of as a normative thing, I think the narrative is a little odd. But as a more sort of just descriptive historical thing, if you look at who's voting for what party in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, the narrative is a lot more complicated. So, for example, this is covering the North a little bit, but New Englanders start tilting Democratic in the 1920s and 30s because of first Prohibition and then the New Deal, right? So it's not like they suddenly decide to flip on civil rights. They're flipping for something else. The Democratic Party in the South is a little more complicated. Did they make you read a book called by V.O. Key, Southern Politics, when you were doing any of the stuff? It's generally considered, it's a really fun book. Most of the book is just like him basically talking to crazy Southern politicos who are fun. So most of it's just fun narrative and colorful characters like Huey Long and whatnot. But at the end of it, he basically says, all right, having studied Southern politics, my assessment is that the Southern Democratic Party can be explained by one thing and one thing only. The whole party, he says, is organized around race. He says to be a Democrat in the South in this era means that you basically agree with white supremacy. You can disagree on economics. And so he says there are basically libertarian, economically conservative, whatever you want to call them, factions, minimal regulation, like pro-business types, right? This faction called the Bourbons, they tended to be a little less racist, partly because they wanted to make money off of Northerners who were squeamish about really explicit racism. So you have that faction, but then you also have a sort of more economically progressive faction. And every time the Democrats would have their primary vote, they would fight basically between those factions. And so, but the one thing that you had to be signing off on in the party is race. And so Key basically says that if economics rather than race ever becomes the cleavage in the South, you would see the party system operate much more normally as it is in the rest of the country, where Republicans and Democrats are fighting about economic issues. So in the 1930s, basically like everywhere else in the US, the sort of more economically progressive populist faction wins basically, and the New Deal is getting pushed through. Even after Franklin Roosevelt in 1938 tries to purge holdouts. So you get this really fascinating period in the 30s where Democratic senators are basically the backbone of Social Security and other things, very generally pro-federal power, except for anything on race. So you can go through and look at in the 30s and the most ferociously racist senators. Cotton, they have fun names, but they're crazy and monstrous. Cotton Ed Smith, Theodore Bilbo, Jimmy Burns, we've talked about him from the Brown episode. He's basically the architect of opposing the effort to basically desegregate the schools, the folks that become the Southern Manifesto signatories. Ira Katznelson has a great book called Fear Itself, which goes through all this. So the Democratic coalition in the 30s is pro-national power for economic, basically, redistribution and welfare state, except on race. Race sort of closes it. But the thing is, in the 30s through the 50s, the South starts normalizing economically. It's really hard for us to appreciate how economically backwards the South is in the 30s. It's like literally almost a third world country in terms of pick any economic measurement, educational attainment, whatever, right? It's so far behind the North and the West. But investment starts coming. Some of this is the New Deal, some of this is infrastructure, some of this is just private investment starts looking around saying, wow, we've got a labor force that we could deal with. And so it turns out that the Southerners start making some money, and many of them decide like, hey, we're middle-class people. We should start voting Republican like middle-class people, middle-class business people in other places. And so you start seeing this realignment in terms of voting behavior happen in the 40s and the 50s especially. So Nixon, for example, I think the clearest reason why I don't buy the sort of Southern switch narrative is the 1960 election. Richard Nixon in 1960 is arguing, now this is in tension with some of his other thinking later, but he's arguing, I am the civil rights presidential candidate. He says, look, Brown v. Board of Education was pushed through by, he says, a Republican Supreme Court. Earl Warren's my bro, right? So they hate each other, actually, but he's basically trying to claim credit for that. And so he says, Brown v. Board was Republican Supreme Court enforced by Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican president. The 1960 Republican Party platform is written by Nelson Rockefeller with a robust civil rights enforcement plank. And yet, the Republican Party continues its steady rise in the South, and the Republicans win 45% of the vote in the South and 3 states, even as Nixon is basically saying, we will be the civil rights party. Right. So the realignment is already starting to happen in some sense, well before the Civil Rights Act. And in fact, when the Republicans are signaling that they're going to be civil rights enforcers. And the sort of additional complication on this is if you look at how the state level politics realign, like Republicans are not doing very well in the South, even as late as like 10 years ago. I think 15 years ago, like Arkansas had 2 Democratic senators. I mean, you look at the state legislative levels as well. Democrats control most of the South, even through the 90s and 2000s. So there's this more sort of cohort. So I guess how do I word this? I think it's clearly empirically wrong to say there was just this immediate switch and then all of the sort of anti-Southern, sort of civil rights senator Democrats switched to the Republicans. You have a couple examples of that, like Strom Thurmond, but most of them actually still remain in the Democratic Party until they get primaried out or forced to retire over the 60s and 70s. The more nuanced version that I think has more merit is that sort of the next generation that didn't grow up as sort of historic Republicans or Democrats, that they were more willing to switch on civil rights. Again, I don't buy that narrative for the reasons that I was just mentioning in terms of the way the parties have shifted, but that's the sort of the more, I think, subtle version. But the sort of normie version that the journalists like and that a lot of tests, et cetera, like is the party switched basically in 1965 to 1968. But if you have a sort of longer scope of history, both before and after, I don't think that narrative holds empirically. But there are still scholars that do. If you would like to, I hate to be self-promoting, but if you would like to, I have a new article coming out called States' Rights and Civil Rights, and you can ignore everything I say, but buried in the bottom is the footnotes going through and sort of laying out the different scholars making these arguments. So you can go back and look at that if you really want to get into the awful weeds of quantitative polling data paired with political history, tedious party political history. So yeah, my states' rights and civil rights piece that I don't know exactly when this is going to air, but it'll be getting published in the next couple of weeks as of February, March, April, somewhere in there.
And listeners, we will put that in there, and I highly suggest that you read it because Dr. Beienberg does not like to self-promote, but he is very popular among our educators and our students. So if it is not immediately in the show notes, I will make sure that it gets posted as soon as it is available. Dr. Beienberg, thank you so much for, again, we're talking so much about political parties and they've changed, so much since their kind of onset in the 1800s. So We greatly appreciate it. And listeners, join us for our next episode where we're just going to kind of give an overview. I say we, it's Dr. Beienberg giving the overview of how Democrats and Republicans have changed over time. Thank you, Dr. Beienberg.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.